Dropped training glove. The Academy rewrote her entire species profile overnight. The glove was already in the air before I even knew I had dropped it. My name is Mara Voss. I am 23 years old, 164 centimeters tall, and until 14 months ago, the most dangerous thing I had ever done was eat gas station sushi on a dare. Now I was standing in the middle of a combat ring at the Interstellar Combat Academy, surrounded by 4 alien species who had been training for war since before my great-grandparents were born, and my left training glove was spinning through the air in a slow, humiliating arc. I had about half a second to make a decision. The Krath warrior across the ring from me, his name was Dorak Vel, and he was built like a concrete wall that had somehow learned to be angry, was already moving. The Krath do not waste time. They do not wait for you to collect yourself, adjust your stance, or recover your dignity. The moment they see an opening, they pour through it like water through a crack, fast and cold and absolutely relentless. Dorak Vel had seen the glove leave my hand, and his body had already calculated exactly where I would be half a second from now, and he was going to meet me there with something that would probably end the round in a single clean motion. I did not think about what I did next. There was no time to think. I dropped my shoulder, bent my knees, and scooped the glove out of the air with my bare right hand as it came back down. The motion carried me low and forward, much lower than any fighting stance the Academy had ever formally taught me, and my momentum pulled me directly inside Dorak Vel's guard. He had been aiming for where I was supposed to be. I was somewhere completely different. My right arm came up under his extended limb. The recovered glove still clutched in my fist, and my left hand grabbed the back of his training harness, and I threw him. He hit the floor of the ring so hard that the sound rang off the walls. There was a moment of silence so complete that I could hear the climate systems in the ceiling. Then the Academy's AI arbiter spoke, and its voice was calm and precise the way only a machine can be when it is about to say something that changes everything. Undefined maneuver, no species profile match. Flagging for review. I stood over Dorak Vel, breathing hard, still holding the glove I had dropped. My hand was shaking slightly. I looked down at the Krath warrior on the floor. He was not unconscious. The Krath are almost impossible to knock out. But he was still, which for a Krath was somehow more alarming. He was staring up at the ceiling with an expression I could not read on his ridged, dark blue face. Then he turned his head and looked at me. Again, he said. I blinked. What? I want to do that again, he said. I need to understand what you did. I did not know how to explain to him that I did not fully understand what I had done either. I had dropped a glove I had not wanted to lose. Everything else had happened in between those two facts like a sentence that wrote itself. The round ended. I walked off the floor. My fellow cadets, all of them non-human, all of them from species with combat histories that stretched back centuries before humanity had figured out iron smelting, were watching me with expressions I had learned to loosely translate over the past 8 months. The Velhari watched with their secondary eyelids half closed, which I had come to understand meant something close to intense, unsettled curiosity. The Dren stood perfectly still, which for them was the equivalent of every alarm in their body going off at once. The 2 Sarath cadets had turned to each other, and were clicking quietly in their rapid, sharp language. And even without a translator, I could tell they were arguing about something. I found my water canteen on the bench along the wall and drank half of it in one go. Lieutenant Commander Priyath, my direct supervising officer, a Velhari, long-limbed and silver-skinned, with 3 parallel lines of blue bioluminescence running down each cheek that flickered when she was thinking hard, walked up beside me without a word. She stood there for a moment, watching the floor of the ring where Dorak Vel had climbed back to his feet and was running the motion of the throw again in slow motion by himself, clearly trying to reconstruct what had happened to him. Cadet Voss, Pri said finally. Yes, ma'am, that glove. Did you intentionally drop it? I looked at her. No, ma'am. I lost my grip during the entry stance shift. My hands were damp. She was quiet for another moment. Her bioluminescent lines flickered steadily, faster than I had ever seen them move before. And the subsequent maneuver? I worked with what I had, I said. She looked at me the way someone looks at a locked door when they suddenly realize they have been trying the wrong key for years. I see, she said, and walked away. I did not know then what she was going to do when she got back to her office. I did not know that she would pull up every combat record I had produced since my arrival at the Academy and annotate each one with notes I would not be allowed to read for another 6 weeks. I did not know that she would contact the xenopsychology department before the training day was even finished. I did not know that by the time I was asleep that night, a review process had been opened under a classification heading I had never seen before. with a title that translates roughly from the Academy's official language as follows: Human Behavioral Anomaly. Reassessment recommended. I just put my glove back on, finished my water, and went to dinner. That was how it started. I had been at the Academy for 8 months by the time the glove incident happened, and those 8 months had been the most humbling experience of my life. The Academy had been running for over 400 years. It trained combat officers from 11 different species across the known settlement zones, and its graduates were among the most respected military professionals in existence. The course was 3 years long. Dropout rates were high. The standards were not adjusted for anyone. Humanity had been accepted into the Academy program after 11 years of formal requests, 6 rounds of testing, and a great deal of political effort that I was too junior to know the details of. I was the 4th human ever admitted, and the first in 3 years. After the previous 2 had washed out in the first year, there were no other humans at the Academy while I was there. I was it. I was the entire sample size. The human species profile that the Academy held on file when I arrived described us as follows, and I had read it, because they gave it to every cadet on arrival so that your fellow students would understand your training parameters. Tier 4 Support Classification. Non-combat primary role, moderate endurance, low impact resistance, high linguistic adaptability. Emotional volatility considered a liability in sustained engagement scenarios. Recommended for logistics, communication, and support functions. Not recommended for frontline combat training without significant modification of course parameters. In other words, they thought we were soft, not useless, soft. Good for talking, good for carrying things, not particularly good for fighting. I had spent 8 months trying to prove that assessment, at least partially wrong, with mixed results. I was not the strongest cadet on the floor. I was not the fastest. My reaction times, as measured by the Academy's standard testing equipment, were slower than every other species enrolled. I could not match the Krath for raw power. I could not match the Velhari for precision. I could not match the Sarath for speed. I got knocked down a great deal in the first 3 months, and I got back up every single time, and I improved, steadily. But I had not done anything that caused anyone to significantly update their understanding of what a human was capable of, until the glove. Dinner that night was quiet for me, loud for everyone else. The Academy's dining hall operated on an open-plan system, meaning all species ate together, which produced a noise environment that took several weeks to get used to. The Krath ate in large groups and debated constantly, their deep voices layering over each other. The Velhari ate in smaller clusters and spoke little, but moved their hands a great deal. The Sarath did not eat in the hall at all. Their dietary requirements meant they used separate facilities. And the Dren ate in near silence, which was the most unsettling option of all, because when 8 large armored creatures sit in a row and eat without making any sound, it tends to catch the attention of every instinct the human brain was built with. I ate alone, which was normal, not because I was excluded, exactly, but because the social dynamics of the dining hall ran on unspoken lines that I had never quite managed to navigate naturally, and I had learned that it was better to observe than to insert self somewhere I did not yet understand. I was working through a tray of something the Academy kitchen had flagged as nutritionally appropriate for humans, which was accurate but charitable, when Doric Vel set his own tray down across from me and sat. I looked at him, he looked at me. Eat, he said. I am not here to challenge you. I want to talk. Among the Krath, sitting across a table from someone rather than beside them is a gesture of direct engagement. It means I am paying attention to you and only you. It is considered a significant social signal. I knew this because I had read every cultural briefing the Academy provided, twice, in my first 2 weeks, because I had decided that if I could not outfight everyone here, I could at least outprepare them. All right, I said. What do you want to talk about? The throw, he said. I already told the lieutenant commander. I dropped the glove and improvised. Yes, he said. That is what I want to understand, the improvisation. When your equipment failed, your body did not stop. It adapted the motion mid-execution and produced an entirely new attack vector from the failure itself. He paused. That is not in any of our training protocols. Not Krath, not any species I have studied. We train for failure by training to not fail. We do not train to convert failure into a weapon. I thought about that for a moment. I did not know that was what I was doing, I said honestly. I just did not want to lose the round. He was quiet for a long time. The Krath have a particular kind of silence. It is not uncomfortable the way human silence between strangers can be. It is evaluating. It is the silence of a mind working through something carefully. That may be, he said finally, the most dangerous thing I have heard a cadet say at this academy in 4 years. I was not entirely sure if he meant it as a compliment. I decided to take it as one. He finished eating, nodded once in the crass gesture of acknowledgement, and left. I sat with my tray and the noise of the dining hall, and the faint, persistent feeling that something had shifted today, in a way I could not quite measure yet. I did not know the half of it. Somewhere in the Academy's deep network, an AI arbiter that had logged 10,000 rounds of combat training and never once produced the phrase undefined maneuver, was running that footage on a loop, trying every classification in its database, and coming up empty every single time. It would keep trying all night. By morning, there were 17 unread messages in my comm queue. The messages were polite. That was the first thing that made me nervous. At the Academy, polite messages from faculty were not standard. Direct was the Academy's default register. You were told what to do, where to be, what you needed to improve, and in what time frame. Formality was reserved for official reprimands and formal commendations. Getting a message that it began with Kadetavas, "Your presence is respectfully requested at your earliest convenience," meant that whoever sent it was choosing their words very carefully. And people who choose their words very carefully are people who are not entirely sure what they are dealing with. I counted the messages at breakfast. 12 were from department heads whose names I recognized from the Academy directory, but had never personally interacted with. 3 were from faculty I had spoken to maybe twice in 8 months. 1 was from the Academy's Xenopsychology division, which I had never had any contact with at all. And the last one, the one I opened last, because something about it made me want to finish my coffee first, was from the Academy director herself. Director Sova Keln was a Velhari who had held her position for 31 years, which in Academy terms meant she had seen everything. She was not a person who sent messages to first-year cadets. The message was 4 sentences long. It read, "Cadet Voss, I have reviewed the footage from yesterday's training session. I would ask that you refrain from repeating the maneuver you performed until we have had an opportunity to meet and discuss it. Please come to my office at your scheduled next break. Thank you." I stared at it for a moment. Then I went to my training session, because the alternative was going back to my room and worrying had never once helped me. The session that morning was scenario-based. The Academy ran these periodically, and they were different from standard sparring in that they did not have clean rules or a clear opponent. You were given a situation and told to resolve it. Sometimes you worked alone. Sometimes you worked with other cadets. Sometimes the scenario changed halfway through. Or the equipment you were given turned out to be wrong for the problem. Or the objective shifted while you were already in motion. I had always found these sessions more natural than pure sparring, which in retrospect should have told me something about myself. Today's scenario: retrieve a communications unit from a collapsed simulation structure, with 3 other cadets, Dorak Vel, a Velhari cadet named Eso Araveth, who I had spoken to occasionally and found quietly intense, and a Dren cadet named Veth Korak, whose armored body could have held 3 of me without straining. The simulation structure had been designed to be partially impassable for cadets of standard strength and size. We ran it. The entry points had been deliberately narrowed. Dorak Vel and Veth Korak could not fit through the central passage without dismantling part of the structure, which would take time and alert the simulation's opposing forces. Eso Araveth could fit, but her specific skeletal structure made the turn at the midpoint difficult. I fit through without difficulty. I had never been the smallest person in a room before coming to the Academy. Among humans, I am fairly average. But among species like the Krath and the Dren, I was slight enough to go places they could not. I went through. I got the communications unit. I came back out. I did it in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The scenario record, according to the post-session report, was 4 minutes and 50 seconds, and it had been held by a Velhari cadet for 6 years. The AI arbiter logged, new scenario record, achieved through unconventional approach path, method, exploiting structural access point not designed as primary entry, species-linked physical factor, human scale differential. Eso Araveth waited until the others were filling out their session logs and then walked up to me. "You went through the narrow passage," she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It landed somewhere in between, in the territory of things that are so obvious that saying them out loud means you are actually saying something else entirely. It was the fastest way in, I said. The passage was not listed in the scenario parameters as a viable entry point. I know, I said. It was not listed as excluded either. She looked at me with those half-closed secondary eyelids I was beginning to understand meant she was thinking hard about something that was bothering her. "You look for the gaps," she said. "In the parameters, in the structure, in the opponent's position." She paused. In the equipment failure yesterday. I shrugged, which I had learned the Velari read as a gesture of casual acknowledgement. When the clear path is gone, you find another one. That is not how we are taught to think, she said. There was nothing critical in her voice. She was simply stating a fact. We are taught the optimal path. We train the optimal path until it is automatic. The assumption is that the optimal path executed perfectly will always be sufficient. And if it is not, I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then we have failed to train hard enough, she said. That is the Velhari doctrine. Train harder so the optimal path never fails. What happens, I said, when the conditions change and the optimal path no longer exists? She had no answer. Not because she was not intelligent. Aso Araveth was one of the sharpest cadets in the cohort. But because the question had not occurred to her before, I could see it happening in real time. The way a thought lands on someone's face before they have decided what to do with it. I left her with it and went to find the academy director's office. Director Sova Keln was tall even for a Velhari, and her bioluminescent lines were the deepest blue I had seen on any member of her species, which I had been told indicated age and rank but also, in some contexts, a kind of authority that went beyond title. She was standing when I entered her office, which was unusual. The Velhari typically sat to receive visitors as a gesture of equalized status, and she gestured to a chair that had clearly been brought in specifically for a human frame. I sat. She sat. She studied me for a moment in the quiet, unhurried way of someone who is deciding where to start a conversation that has no obvious beginning. Kade Voss, she said. I want to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer. Yes, ma'am. When you dropped your glove yesterday and then executed the recovery throw, were you performing a technique you had practiced? No, ma'am. Had you planned it? No, ma'am. Had you seen a similar technique in any training record, any historical database, any cultural reference material? I thought about it genuinely, which she seemed to appreciate. Not that I can identify, I said. It felt like something I invented in the moment, but I could be wrong. I have watched a great deal of training footage from many species in my preparation for this academy. Something could have been in there without me consciously registering it. She nodded. The AI Arbiter has reviewed all combat training records in the Academy database going back 140 years, she said. It has also cross-referenced records from 12 affiliated training institutions. No matching technique has been found. She paused. It has flagged your maneuver as a novel tactical approach. The first such flag in 63 years of automated arbitration. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. I want to be honest with you, she said. And the frankness in her voice was something I had not expected. The Academy has a species profile on record for humans. We use these profiles to calibrate training expectations, to design appropriate scenarios, to pair cadets appropriately. The profile we hold for your species, and this is not a criticism, simply a fact, was built on limited data. 4 individuals, observation periods of between 4 and 18 months. It has significant gaps. She let that sit. Yesterday's incident, she continued. And your scenario performance this morning. Both have been flagged as data points that do not fit the existing profile. The Xenopsychology department has requested a formal review. She looked at me steadily. This is not a disciplinary matter. You have broken no rules. You have done nothing wrong. What I want you to know is that the Academy takes this very seriously, and you will likely find yourself under closer observation than you have been. I understand, I said. Is there anything you would like to ask me? I thought about it. Then I said, the profile says humans are non-combat, tier 4 support. Is that going to change? She was quiet for exactly long enough to confirm that the question had teeth. That, she said, is precisely what we are trying to determine. I walked back to the training wing. The hallways of the academy were wide and always slightly cool. The climate was calibrated for a median tolerance across enrolled species, which meant it was comfortable for no one in particular, and workable for everyone. I passed a group of Krath cadets, who had, until yesterday, generally acknowledged my existence with the particular brand of polite indifference that the large and confident extend to the small and unthreatening. 3 of them moved aside more than necessary as I passed. One of them watched me go. I kept walking. I kept my face neutral. But something in my chest was starting to understand the shape of what was happening. And it was not a small shape. Somewhere in the Academy's network, a xenopsychology team was opening a file they had not expected to need. They were reaching back through decades of human military history, athletic records, survival accounts, and crisis response data. And they were starting to look for something they had not known they were supposed to look for. Not how humans performed under ideal conditions. How humans performed when everything went wrong. And the answer, the more they looked, was always the same. We got worse briefly. Then we got strange. Then we got effective in ways that did not look like anything they had a name for. They worked through the night. I did not know that yet. I was asleep by the time they found the first pattern. I was still asleep when they found the second. By the time I woke up, they were not sleeping at all, and the file was already 40 pages long, and someone had written at the top of page 1, in the careful, precise notation of an academic who is trying to remain calm. Preliminary finding. The human improvisation response under failure conditions may not be an anomaly. It may be a species-level adaptation. They underlined it 3 times. I started to feel watched on a Tuesday. Not watched the way you feel when an instructor is evaluating your form, or when a senior cadet is sizing up a potential sparring partner. This was different. This was the feeling of being studied, the way you study something you do not yet have a category for. I would be halfway through a training drill and catch 2 faculty members on the upper observation deck, looking at each other instead of their notepads after something I had done. I would finish a scenario run and find that the post-session debrief was longer than usual, with questions phrased in that careful, unhurried way that meant the person asking already had a hypothesis and was checking it against my answers. It was not unpleasant exactly, but it was not comfortable either. The strangest part was how the other cadets changed, not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally. Over the 2 weeks following the glove incident, the social temperature around me shifted in a way I could not fully name. The Krath cadets, who had been professionally indifferent to me for 8 months, started requesting sparring rounds. Not fighting for fun. The Krath do not spar for fun. They spar to learn, but fighting specifically and deliberately to see what I would do in given situations. Doric Vell was in the ring with me 4 times in 2 weeks. Each time, he would set up a scenario where something went slightly wrong. Equipment misaligned, footing compromised, the entry point he expected me to take suddenly unavailable, and then he would watch. The Vilhari cadets were more subtle. So Araveth started appearing in scenarios I was assigned to, sometimes as a partner, sometimes as an opposing force, and she had the particular Vilhari talent for positioning herself where she could observe without appearing to observe. She asked me questions after sessions. They were always framed as casual, conversational. They were never casual. When the floor gave way in the secondary corridor yesterday, she said one afternoon, "You changed direction before the structural failure was visually apparent." How? The vibration pattern was different under my feet, I said. It felt wrong before it looked wrong. She wrote something in her small personal notepad, which she did not normally do during informal conversations. "You perceive environmental information through physical sensation more acutely than your species profile indicates," she said. "I do not know if it is acute," I said. "It might just be that I pay attention to it." "Why would you pay attention to it if your species profile does not flag it as a significant data source?" I looked at her. "Because someone in my family history paid attention to it, and it kept them alive long enough to have children," I said. "I did not read that in a manual. It is just what humans do." She looked at me for a long moment with her secondary eyelids half closed. Then she said, very quietly, "I think your species profile is wrong." 2 days later, Professor Edrin Valal from the Xenopsychology department appeared at the edge of a training floor I was using for solo practice. He was a Dren, heavily built, with the wide flat face and deep-set eyes of a species that had evolved in environments with low light and high pressure. He stood at the edge for a while, watching me run movement drills, and then he walked over. "Kade Voss," he said, "I would like to speak with you off the record, if you are willing." "All right," I said. He glanced around the floor, confirming we were alone, and then said, "I want to be direct with you because I believe you deserve directness. My department has been reviewing your performance data since the incident 10 days ago. We have also been reviewing historical records of human behavior under stress, failure and emergency conditions going back approximately 60 years. And," I said, "we have been wrong about your species," he said. "Not entirely wrong. Some of the profile data is accurate. Your physical parameters are as recorded. But the behavioral assessments, specifically the assessments around combat suitability, adaptability under pressure, and response to failure, those are significantly incorrect." I kept my voice even. "In what direction?" "In the direction of substantial underestimation," he said. He let that land. "What we believed," he continued, "was that human improvisation under stress was a liability, an indicator of insufficient training, of a species that had not yet achieved the level of systematic discipline that produces reliable combat performance. What we are now seeing, what the data is showing us, is that it is not a liability at all. It is a capability. A specific, distinct, and in many ways unprecedented capability." He paused. "When a trained organism encounters a scenario for which it has no programmed response, the standard outcome is hesitation, error, or shutdown. What humans appear to do instead is generate new responses in real time from partial information, incomplete resources, and adverse conditions. Not all the time, not reliably by any standard metric, but at a rate and with a consistency that suggests it is not random. It is a feature." I was quiet for a moment. The training floor hummed with the low vibration of the Academy's systems running in the background. "You make it sound very impressive," I said. "When I did it, it felt like panic that happened to work." He looked at me with his deep, flat, unreadable Dren face. "Yes," he said, "that is, I think, a significant part of it." He left. I stood in the middle of the training floor and thought about what he had said for a long time. That evening, S.O. Araveth found me in the small common room adjacent to the cadet quarters, one of the few spaces in the Academy that had been calibrated specifically for social interaction rather than training or study, which meant it had slightly warmer lighting than the rest of the building and furniture at multiple heights and configurations to accommodate different body types. I was reading. She sat across from me. "I need to ask you something," she said. "You need to ask me a lot of things," I said, without looking up from my reader. "You have been asking me things for 2 weeks. This one is different," she said. I put down the reader. She was not using her academic observation voice. This was something else, more direct, less managed. "When you dropped that glove," she said, "and you threw Doric Vel, you said you were not thinking, that your body just responded." "Yes, but it was not a random response. It was a correct one. It was optimal given the circumstances." She paused. "How does a body produce an optimal response without the mind directing it?" I thought about it, not because the answer was hard, but because the answer was something I had never had to put into words before. It was like being asked to explain how you breathe. "When humans train," I said slowly, "we do not only train the techniques, we train the underlying principles. Weight, momentum, leverage, timing. We understand why things work, not just that they work. So when a specific technique fails, when the conditions are wrong or the equipment is gone, or the position is different from what we expected, the principles are still there. The body knows the principles. It finds a new application." S.O. Araveth was still. "The Vilhari method," I continued, "trains the technique to perfection. You trust the technique because it has been proven optimal. It almost always works because you are almost always prepared." "And when we are not prepared?" she asked. "Then you have the technique but not the principle," I said. "And a technique without a principle is like a key without a lock. It only opens one door." She sat with that for a long time. The common room was quiet around us. Somewhere down the corridor, Krath cadets were in a heated discussion that occasionally broke into laughter, which was a sound I had come to associate with the end of a training day, the same way I used to associate the closing of an office with the end of a workday. A punctuation mark, a signal that something had finished. "I am going to be honest with you," S.O. Araveth said. "There are cadets here, and to faculty, who are not comfortable with what is happening with you. Not because of anything you have done wrong, because you are disrupting a model that has worked for a very long time, and it is unsettling to discover that a model you trusted may have had a gap in it." "I understand that," I said. "Do you understand that the gap is specifically about your species?" she said. "That what they are discovering is not just that Mara Voss is an unusual cadet, but that humanity itself has been categorized incorrectly for years. That every human who came before you was assessed through a framework that could not actually see what they were doing." I understood it. I had been turning it over in my mind for days, actually, in the quiet moments between training sessions and meals and the ordinary business of being a cadet. The weight of it was significant, not unpleasant. There was something that functioned like vindication in it, something that I recognized as pride on behalf of people I would never meet. Every human who had sat across a table from an alien representative and been told, kindly and precisely, that we were not quite suited for something. But the weight was real. "Yes," I said, "I understand it." She nodded slowly. "Good," she said, "because I think it is going to get considerably more complicated before it gets simpler." She was more right than either of us knew. 3 days later, the Xenopsychology Department formally requested access to the Academy's complete historical archive of human performance data, going back to the first human admission. The request required Director Sova Keln's personal authorization. She gave it. The same day, 2 senior faculty members from the Combat Training Division submitted a joint memo requesting that the Academy's human species profile be placed under formal review status. which meant it could not be used as a basis for training decisions until the review was complete. I found out about the memo not from any official communication but from Dorak Vel, who had sources in the faculty administrative offices that I never fully understood. He told me over breakfast. He had taken to joining me for meals with a regularity that I had stopped questioning, in the flat, direct way of the Krath, without preamble or softening. "The profile is under review," he said. "This is significant." "How significant?" I said. "A species profile has not been formally reviewed at this academy in 19 years, he said. "The last one was the Sarath profile, after a cohort study revealed that the existing data had been collected during an anomalous social period in their history and did not represent standard Sarath behavior." He picked up his food, ate some of it, and set it down. "That review took 8 months and resulted in the complete replacement of the profile. The Sarath were reclassified from Tier 2 to Tier 1 combat candidates." I looked at my tray. "The human profile," he said, "has not been reviewed since it was written. It was based on 4 individuals. The team that wrote it spent a combined total of 14 months observing those 4 individuals." He paused. "You have been here for 8 months. In 8 months, you have produced more data points that do not fit the existing profile than the profile's original authors collected in total." I did not say anything. "I want you to know," he said, in a tone that was as close to careful as I had ever heard from a Krath, "that when I asked you to spar again on the day it happened, when I said I needed to understand what you did, I was not trying to defeat you. I was trying to understand if it was repeatable, if it was real." "Is it?" I asked. He looked at me with his dark, intelligent eyes, the bioluminescent spots along his jaw faintly lit in the academy's morning lighting. "Every time I set up a scenario where something fails," he said, "you find a way through. Not the same way. A different way each time. The response is never identical, but it is never absent." He paused. "In Krath combat doctrine, a technique that cannot be repeated reliably is not a technique. It is luck. But what you do, it repeats, not the action, the capacity. The capacity to find the path when the path disappears." He picked up his food again. "That is not luck. I do not know what to call it yet, but it is not luck." I sat with that all day. The document arrived in my personal comm queue on a Thursday morning at 6:14, before morning training. I almost missed it because it was filed under a designation I did not recognize, a string of alphanumeric code that turned out to be the Academy's internal classification system for species profile documents. The sender was listed as Cadet Technical Support, which was not a name but a service account, and attached to the message was a single note. "You should just see this. No name." The attachment was 47 pages long. The cover read Human Species Profile, Interim Revised Assessment, compiled by the Xenopsychology Division in collaboration with combat training faculty. Classification, active review, not for external distribution. I read it in my room, sitting on the edge of my bunk, with the door closed, before anyone else in my section was awake. The opening pages were dense with data I recognized, the physical parameters from my own testing, the performance metrics from 8 months of training records, the AI arbiter logs that had accumulated since my arrival. They had pulled everything, every round, every scenario, every time drill. They had cross-referenced it all against the original profile and produced a comparison chart that was, honestly, difficult to look at. Because the gap between what the original profile predicted and what I had actually done was wide enough in some categories to make the original profile look like it had been describing a different species entirely. Then came the behavioral analysis section, and that was where I had to slow down and read carefully. The original profile had characterized human improvisation under stress as follows. Emotional response to failure may produce reactive behavior that mimics tactical creativity but lacks structural foundation. Not recommended for high-stakes scenarios due to unreliability. The interim revised assessment characterized it as demonstrated capacity for real-time solution generation under conditions of resource loss, environmental disruption, and task parameter change. Mechanism not fully understood. Reliability metrics pending further study. Preliminary assessment. This is a trained and culturally embedded capability, not an emotional response artifact. They had stopped calling it a flaw. They had started calling it a mechanism. The reclassification section was on page 31. I read it 3 times. Original classification, Tier 4 support, non-combat primary, recommended for logistics, communication, and support functions. Interim revised classification, pending final review. Proposed new category designation required. No existing classification tier adequately describes the observed capability set. Working title for internal use, Adaptive Generalist. In the notes below the proposed classification, someone, I suspected Professor Edrin Valal, from the writing style, had added. The defining challenge in reclassifying the human candidate profile is that human combat capability does not operate as a fixed value. It scales with environmental complexity. Under simple, controlled conditions, human cadets perform at or below the median for enrolled species. Under complex, disrupted, or novel conditions, their performance increases in ways that do not follow standard performance curves. The existing tier system was built on the assumption that a species' combat capability is a stable property. Human capability appears to be a function of context. This is not a property the tier system can accommodate without modification. I put the document down. I looked at the wall of my room. Outside in the corridor, I could hear the academy beginning its morning cycle. Ventilation systems shifting to active, lights in the hallways warming to training intensity, the distant rhythmic sound of cadets beginning their pre-training warm-up routines at the volume of people who had never once been told they were too loud. I thought about the 4 humans who had come before me. I thought about the 2 who had washed out. I thought about what it must have been like to be assessed against a profile that could not see you, to be measured by a framework built on the assumption that what you were doing was unremarkable, and to fail not because you were not capable but because the instrument measuring you had been designed for something else. I thought about every human who had ever sat across a table, from someone who knew what the data said and felt the quiet, considered weight of being categorized as insufficient. Then I got up, put on my training gear, and went to morning practice. I did not tell anyone I had read the document. Not yet. I needed to sit with it first. I needed to understand what it meant, not just what it said. What it said was clear enough. The Academy now believed it had been wrong about humans. What it meant was something larger, something that extended past me and past this Academy, and past this single incident with a dropped glove and a thrown opponent. It meant that the framework had been wrong. And if the framework had been wrong here, in this institution, in this careful and methodical and centuries-old system, then it was almost certainly wrong in other places too. The political reactions started arriving 4 days later. I knew about them because Aso Aravith told me. She had a quiet network of information sources among the Velhari faculty that she deployed selectively, and always with the disclaimer that she could not vouch for the accuracy of everything she heard. But what she told me that afternoon, sitting in the small common room with the warm lighting, was this. 3 of the allied species represented at the Academy had submitted formal communiques to the director's office expressing concern about the interim review. Not concern that the review was incorrect, concern that it was correct. The Seraph, the Velhari faction that oversaw the Academy's Standards Committee, and a species I had not interacted with. The Marin, who supplied the largest single cohort of cadets and had a significant institutional stake in how the Academy operated, had all, independently, raised the question of whether human enrollment should be reconsidered pending the completion of the review. Not because they think we are dangerous, I said partly, Aso Aravith said carefully, but more specifically because the review, if it stands, will require the Academy to modify its classification system. The tier system has been stable for over 80 years. The Sarath reclassification 19 years ago was accommodated within the existing tiers. What is being proposed for humans cannot be accommodated within the existing tiers. A new category would need to be created. She paused. A category that describes capability as context-dependent rather than fixed. This is not a minor administrative adjustment. It is a philosophical change in how the Academy understands combat potential. I stared at her. They want to limit human enrollment because accepting that our capability is real would mean rethinking the entire classification system. Yes, she said. And rethinking the classification system might reveal other gaps. Almost certainly, she said. I sat back. So the problem is not that we are weak, I said. The problem is that we broke their model by being something they did not have a category for. She looked at me with those half-closed secondary eyelids, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked something approaching sad. The hardest things to accept, she said, are not the things that prove you wrong. They are the things that prove your framework was wrong. Because if the framework was wrong, everything built on it becomes uncertain. I thought about that for a long time after she left. I thought about it that night, lying in my bunk, looking at the ceiling. I thought about the 17 messages from faculty members I had received the morning after the glove incident, and the careful, polite language in all of them, and the careful, polite language of Director Sova Keln in her office, and the careful, polite language of Professor Edrin Valal telling me off the record that they had been wrong. I thought about how much care had gone into all of that politeness, and what it was protecting. It was protecting the framework. It was protecting the assumption that what they already knew was sufficient, that the categories they had built were complete, that a species could be assessed, filed, and understood, and that the assessment was not something that needed to be revisited every time the data did not fit. I thought about my species, not as a profile, not as a set of metrics, as the actual, specific, irreducibly strange thing that we were. Creatures who had climbed down from trees and crossed oceans on wood, who had looked at the sky and decided it was not a ceiling, who had failed spectacularly at nearly everything we tried and kept trying anyway. Not because we had a strategic framework for failure management, but because giving up had always felt worse than going again. We were not optimized. We were not consistent. We were not predictable. We were the species that dropped the glove and found a throw in the falling. I thought about the cadets who would come after me, if this went the right way. The humans who would arrive at this academy and not have to spend 8 months being underestimated by a profile that had been built by people who were looking at humans and seeing only what they had expected to see. I decided what I was going to say to Director Sovakeln when she called me in. I did not have to wait long. She called me in the next morning, not to her formal office this time, to a smaller conference room adjacent to the administrative wing, the kind of room used for conversations that need to be off the calendar. When I arrived, she was not alone. Professor Edrin Valal was there. So was a senior faculty member I had not spoken to before, a Velhari named Commander Eros Tylan, who oversaw the Academy's Standards and Classifications Division. Sitting slightly apart from the others with the careful stillness of someone who is present as an observer rather than a participant, was Iso Araveth. I took the seat they indicated and I waited. Director Sovakeln spoke first. Cadet Voss, you are here because the review of your species profile has reached a point where we need to have a direct conversation with you about what comes next. This is not a hearing. You are not under review as an individual. This conversation is about an institutional decision, and you are part of it. I understand, I said. The interim revised assessment, she said, recommends a formal reclassification of the human species profile. The reclassification cannot be completed within the current tier structure. If it is to be completed accurately, a new classification category must be created, one that accounts for context-dependent capability. She paused. This is a significant institutional change. There is resistance to it. I know, I said. Eso Araveth told me about the 3 species who submitted formal objections. No one looked surprised that I knew. Eso Araveth looked at the table. The objections are not without merit, said Commander Eros Talon, whose voice was sharp and precise in the way of someone who had spent a career working in formal institutional structures. A classification system exists to create predictability. If we introduce a category that explicitly describes a species as unpredictable, we undermine the system's foundational premise. With respect, I said, the foundational premise was already incorrect. The system predicted that I would be a Tier 4 support candidate with limited combat application. The data says otherwise. The premise failed before I walked in the door. The question is whether the system adapts or whether it maintains a fiction. There was a silence. It was not hostile. It was the silence of people who have heard something that they cannot immediately disagree with, and are taking time to decide how to engage with it. Professor Edrin Valal cleared his throat. Cadet Voss makes a point that is consistent with the review findings, he said. The system did not fail because of Cadet Voss specifically. It failed because it was built on insufficient data and an incorrect foundational assumption about human behavior. The question of whether to update the system is a question about whether we value accuracy over institutional stability. Commander Eros Tylan looked at him. Institutional stability is not a trivial concern. No, said Edrin Valal, but neither is accuracy. Director Sovakeln held up one long-fingered hand and both of them stopped. She looked at me. Cadet Voss, I want to offer you a choice. I waited. You can continue your enrollment as a cadet, under the revised assessment, with the understanding that you will be under significantly more attention than a standard cadet. Your performance data will be central to the ongoing review process. This is not a punishment. It is simply the reality of being the primary data source for an active institutional revision. She paused. Alternatively, you can be offered a new role, one that does not currently exist at this academy, a liaison position. The first human to formally assist the academy in developing a more accurate framework for understanding human capability. This would involve continued training, but also collaboration with the xenopsychology and combat divisions in designing new assessment methodologies. She let the 2 options sit in the room. There is a third option, I said. She looked at me. Everyone looked at me. I will take the liaison role, I said. But not alone. I want the academy to increase human enrollment, not one cadet every 3 years, a proper cohort. If the review has found that the existing data was insufficient, if 4 individuals over 14 months produced a profile that was fundamentally wrong, then the solution is more data, not one data point studied very carefully. I looked at Director Sovakiln directly. I am not a sample, I am one person. You cannot understand my species by watching me. You need to see a dozen of us, 50 of us, see what we do differently from each other and what we do the same. If the Academy genuinely wants to correct the error in the profile, that is how it gets corrected. The room was quiet again. Longer this time. You are aware, said Commander Arosteon slowly, that the existing objections from allied species already concern themselves with the disruptive effect of a single human cadet. A cohort would generate considerably more institutional friction. Yes, I said. It would also generate considerably more accurate data. And, I added, considerably more capability for whoever we are ultimately training to serve alongside. He looked at me for a long moment. He had the Velhari quality of a face that did not give much away, but his bioluminescent lines were flickering steadily, which I had come to read as serious engagement. You are negotiating, he said. There was something in his voice that might have been the Velvahiri equivalent of being impressed, though I was not certain. I am being direct, I said, which is what Director Sovakiln asked for when we first spoke. She made a sound that I had learned over 8 months to recognize as Velhari laughter. Quiet, controlled, genuine. Yes, she said, I did. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I cannot promise a full cohort immediately. What I can promise is that your proposal will be formally incorporated into the review recommendations. It will go to the institutional board. It will be argued for. She looked at me steadily, and I will argue for it personally. That was more than I had walked in expecting. I said, that is enough. We talked for another hour, practical things, logistics, timelines, what the liaison role would actually involve, what my training schedule would look like, how the xenopsychology collaboration would be structured. I answered questions, asked some of my own, and by the time I left the room, I had a headache from concentration and the particular tired clarity that comes from having said things that mattered in a situation where the saying of them made a difference. I went back to the training wing. I changed into my gear. I went out onto the floor and ran drills alone for an hour, moving through the motions that had become familiar over 8 months. Familiar but never entirely automatic, because I had spent 8 months learning not just the techniques, but the principles underneath them. And the principles were alive in a way the techniques alone could never be. Dorak Vel appeared at the edge of the floor 20 minutes in. I heard you were in the director's office this morning, he said. News travels fast. Krath communication networks are efficient, he said, which was the most diplomatic thing I had ever heard him say about the fact that his people were constitutionally incapable of keeping anything quiet. What happened? I am said in a new capacity, and I asked for more humans to be enrolled. He was quiet for a moment, then he walked onto the floor. Good, he said. Are you sparring or drilling? Drilling, I said. I will drill with you, he said, which from a Krath was the same as saying, I think you are worth my time, and I want to keep learning from you. All right, I said. We drilled together for another hour. He pushed me, as he always did. Faster entries, harder angles, positions that were slightly wrong in ways that forced me to adjust mid-motion. Each time something went slightly wrong, I found my way through. Not the same way twice, but through, always through. At the end of the hour, he said, do you know what we call it in Krath? What you know, I said. We have a word, he said. Tretzfutlates approximately as the motion that continues past the obstacle. We use it as a compliment. It is what we say about water. I thought about that. Water does not know it is doing it, I said. No, he said. That is why it always finds the way through. We put the equipment away. The training floor was quiet in the late afternoon, the academy systems humming softly in the background. The light through the upper observation windows, the particular amber of a day winding toward its end. I did not know yet whether the institutional board would approve a human cohort. I did not know whether the profile revision would pass through the 3 objecting species resistance. I did not know whether what had started with a dropped glove in a sparring ring would grow into something that actually changed the way the known settlement zones thought about my species. But I knew that the framework had cracked, and I knew that frameworks, once cracked, do not return to the shape they were before. They either break entirely, which is its own kind of beginning, or they reshape around the new information, which is how anything real ever grows. I walked back to the cadet wing. The hallways were filling up with the end-of-day movement of cadets from every species. Tall and wide and small and loud and quiet. All of them trained and training. All of them trying to become something that could be counted on when things went wrong. I moved through them the same way I always had. Taking the path that was open, adjusting to the current, finding my way forward in the gaps that everyone else moved through too quickly to notice. The new batch of human cadets would arrive, eventually. They would walk these halls and look up at the Krath and the Velhari and the Dren and feel exactly the way I had felt in my first week. Small, underprepared, surrounded by evidence that the universe had been doing this much longer than we had. They would have bad days. They would drop things at the wrong moment and find themselves in positions they had not trained for, and have to invent solutions out of whatever was in their hands. And every single time they did, it would not be a mistake. It would be exactly what we were. I stopped at the end of the hallway, at the window that looked out over the Academy's landing platforms where ships arrived and departed on cycles I had long since memorized. I looked out at the sky over the Academy and thought about what Dorkvel had said. The motion that continues past the obstacle. We had been calling it improvisation. We had been calling it adaptability. The profile had been calling it unreliability. Professor Edrin Valal was calling it a mechanism. Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe none of them were quite right. Maybe the truest name for it was something we had always known, even if we had never written it down in a species profile or an academic review or a combat classification system. We were the species that had looked at everything that could go wrong and decided to go anyway. Not because we were fearless. We were not even close. But because the alternative was standing still. And standing still had never once in the history of everything we had ever done been the answer. We were the least finished. That was not a flaw. That was the point. I turned away from the window and went to dinner. There was a message in my queue that I had not opened yet. The first formal communication from the Xenopsychology Division, addressed to me in my new capacity. The subject line read, Working Session, 090 tomorrow, Conference Room 4. Agenda, Developing New Assessment Criteria for Human Cognitive Adaptability Under Failure Conditions. Please bring any thoughts you have on how you would describe the mechanism yourself. I read it twice. Then I opened a reply and typed, I have several thoughts. I will see you at 9. I sent it. I closed the comm. I ate my dinner in the warm, loud company of the Academy's dining hall, surrounded by species who were beginning to understand that what they had taken for a gap in the data was actually just the beginning of a much larger and more interesting question. I did not feel like a symbol. I did not feel like a representative of my species, or a data point, or the subject of a profile revision, or anything other than a person who had come a very long way to learn something, and was finding out that the learning went in more directions than she had planned for. I felt mostly like myself, and for the first time since I had arrived at the Academy, that felt like exactly enough.